I carry it with me every single day. Every ring, every trophy, every standing ovation in every arena that ever chanted my name. I carry it right alongside all of it. Because when the moment came, the one moment that actually mattered, beyond the court, beyond the stats, beyond everything I laced up my shoes and played basketball, those words didn't come from a press conference podium. They weren't delivered into a bank of microphones after a victory, with confetti still falling. They came out quietly, almost involuntarily, in the middle of a long magazine interview in 2022. Stephen Curry was sitting across from a journalist who had asked him something nobody expected him to answer so honestly. At the time of that interview, he had 4 championship rings. He was the most decorated shooter in the history of professional basketball. And he was sitting there, voice dropping lower than usual, jaw tight, talking about the worst decision of his life. Not a missed shot, not a blown series. A Saturday morning in April 2014, in a locker room in Oakland, California, when 30 grown men had a chance to stop the world from spinning for just one day, and chose not to. What makes a man carry something like that for 8 years through the greatest winning stretch of his life? That's the question this story is trying to answer. And to get there, you have to start a long way back from Oakland in Charlotte, North Carolina, in a house where professional basketball was just the furniture. Stephen Wardle Curry was born on March 14, 1988. His father, Del Curry, played 16 seasons in the NBA, most of them as a reliable scorer for the Charlotte Hornets. Del was quiet, steady. Not a superstar, but the kind of player every team needed, the one who hit the open three when the defense collapsed on the star. He won an NBA title with the Milwaukee Bucks in 2003, near the end of his career, coming off the bench and doing exactly what was asked of him. Del Curry was a professional in the purest sense of the word. Growing up in that household meant basketball was always there, game film on the television, the smell of a practice gym permanently embedded in the furniture, a father who could break down every aspect of the game at the kitchen table. It might sound like an advantage, and in some ways it was. But it also meant that Stephen grew up acutely aware of the distance between playing the game and being great at it. He had seen great players up close. He knew what greatness required, and he also knew, from a very early age, that he was small. Not slow, not uncoordinated, small. At Charlotte Christian High School, where he played point guard, the college scouts came to watch his teammates, not him. He was wiry and light. In an era when major college programs were recruiting big physical guards who could score in traffic, Stephen Curry looked like someone's equipment manager. Division I programs showed no real interest. His father's name didn't open the doors his talent deserved. Davidson College, a small liberal arts school in Davidson, North Carolina, town population around 12,000, offered him a scholarship. It was the best offer he got. He took it, packed his bags, and went to a campus where the biggest athletic facility was modest, and the basketball program was a genuine underdog in the college landscape. And then he turned the whole country sideways. By his sophomore year at Davidson, Stephen was averaging over 28 points per game. In the 2008 NCAA tournament, Davidson pulled off a series of upsets that made the sports world stop and stare. Stephen Curry was the reason. He shot the ball from distances that hadn't really been weaponized at that level 5, 6 feet behind the three-point arc, off the dribble, with defenders' hands in his face. The ball went in, repeatedly, impossibly. Davidson's run ended in the Elite Eight, but Stephen Curry's legend was already in motion. The Golden State Warriors selected him with the 7th pick in the 2009 NBA draft. 7th. Not first, not second, not even third. There were analysts who thought that was a reach. He was too thin. He was a shooting specialist from a low-major college. He had never played against Big Ten or ACC competition. He was Del Curry's son. The whispers followed him to Oakland. Those first seasons were hard in a way that had nothing to do with the game. His ankles became the story. Left ankle surgery in the summer of 2011, the same ankle again in 2012. A third procedure. 3 surgeries in roughly 24 months on the same joint, at the beginning of a career that required him to plant and pivot and change direction hundreds of times per game. The medical staff was careful and patient. The organization was, publicly at least, supportive. But anyone paying attention knew the truth. There was a real possibility Stephen Curry would never be fully healthy. And an NBA career built on an unreliable ankle was no career at all. He has talked about those rehabilitation periods in various interviews over the years. The hours in the training room, the slow, grinding repetition of exercises designed to rebuild stability in a joint that kept betraying him. What he has described, without being dramatic about it, is a kind of enforced patience that changed how he approached his craft. When you can't run and cut and play, you do what you can. He worked on his shooting release. He worked on footwork. He worked on the arc and the timing and the precise mechanics of getting the ball over a closing defender without needing an extra step. He turned recovery time into refinement time. And what emerged from those rehabilitation periods was a shooting motion so economical, so quick, so precisely calibrated that it eventually made traditional defensive theories nearly obsolete. By the 2012-13 season, the pieces around him were beginning to matter. Klay Thompson, drafted in 2011, was developing into a weapon in his own right, another exceptional shooter, longer than Curry, physically imposing in ways Curry never would be. Draymond Green, a second-round pick from Michigan State, was turning into something unusual. A player without an obvious position who could defend anyone, distribute the ball at a high level, and lead by sheer force of competitive intensity. Head coach Mark Jackson was installing a culture of toughness and accountability. General manager Bob Myers was making quiet but important decisions. The scaffolding of something serious was going up, even if nobody outside the Bay Area was paying close enough attention to notice. Stephen averaged over 22 points per game that season. He led the league in three-pointers made. The Warriors won 47 games, their best record in years. They won a first-round playoff series against Denver. And then they pushed the San Antonio Spurs, who were in the middle of a dynasty of their own, to 6 games before losing progress. Real progress. Not a fluke, not a narrative, not a marketing campaign. Actual progress, measured in wins and performances, and the growing understanding that this team and this player were legitimate. The 2013-14 season brought more of the same. 51 wins. Another playoff berth. The Warriors were seeded 6th in the Western Conference. J. Redick providing shooting, Doc Rivers in his first season, coaching the team after a decade building the Boston Celtics. This was the year the Clippers were supposed to break through. They had been building toward a championship window, and this was it. What nobody knew, or rather what the public didn't know yet, was that a tape recorder had been running, and what it captured was about to change everything. Friday, April 25th, 2014. TMZ published an audio recording, 9 minutes and 24 seconds. The voice on the tape belonged to Donald Sterling, 80 years old, billionaire, owner of the Los Angeles Clippers since 1981. 33 years, he was speaking to his girlfriend, Vanessa Stiviano, who had made the recording. And what he said on that tape was not complicated, not ambiguous, not a matter of tone being misinterpreted. He told her he did not want her bringing black people to Clippers games. He told her not to post photos on social media that showed her with black people, specifically mentioning Magic Johnson by name. He said he provided for black people, fed them, clothed them with the implication that gratitude, not equality, was the appropriate response. He spoke about race with the casual contempt of a man who had been saying these things privately for decades and had simply never been recorded doing it. The tape was 9 minutes and 24 seconds long. By Saturday morning, every player in the NBA had heard it. Stephen Curry was at home in the East Bay. He was 26 years old. He had been in the league 5 years, had won playoff games, had survived 3 ankle surgeries, had worked his way from 7th pick to genuine star. He had never been asked to stand at the intersection of sport and something this raw and this large. He sat with his phone, listening to a recording of an old man's voice reduce human beings to a category, to something to be managed, kept separate, kept quiet. Then he got in his car and drove to Oracle Arena. I want to stay with that moment for a second, because there is a version of this story where you describe what happened next in terms of the game, the scores, the strategic adjustments, who guarded whom, who hit the big shots, and that story is accurate. But it misses what was actually happening. What was happening was that approximately 15 young black men were driving to a basketball arena while processing the knowledge that the sport they had sacrificed most of their childhoods to reach was owned, in significant part, by people who thought of them as a product rather than as people. That's not a metaphor. That's the thing they were all turning over as they drove to work on that Saturday morning. The Golden State Warriors' locker room before that afternoon's game was not loud. Playoff locker rooms carry a specific energy-focused, ritualistic, almost ceremonial. Players have pre-game routines they've followed for years. Music at certain volumes, stretching in specific sequences, the mind narrowing from everything outside to the one task in front of it. That Saturday, the narrowing wasn't happening. Players sat with their phones, the conversations were low and serious and didn't have anything to do with the Clippers' pick-and-roll coverage. The question that found its way to the floor was direct. Do we play? Andre Iguodala was 30 years old. In his 10th year in the league, a man who had seen more of the NBA's machinery than most of the other players in that room. He had been through trades, through losing teams, through roster upheavals. He understood how the business worked, and that afternoon he spoke plainly. They needed to decide what they were doing, they needed to decide together, and they needed to decide before they walked out of this locker room. He laid out what a boycott would look like. He laid out the symbolic gesture option, removing their warm-up jerseys, playing in plain shirts, stripping away the team branding attached to an institution suddenly made shameful. He didn't tell them what to do. He made sure they knew they had a choice. Across town at Staples Center, the Clippers were having a longer and louder version of the same conversation. Chris Paul, the Clippers' point guard and one of the most politically literate players in the league, was not interested in subtlety. He was furious, in a way that had been building since the moment he first heard the tape. Paul had come up in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, the grandson of a man named Nathaniel Jones, who was murdered by 2 white teens in 1959, a history he carried with him always, quietly but fully. Hearing Donald Sterling's voice saying what it said wasn't abstract for him, it was intimate. The Clippers' locker room debated seriously, in direct terms, whether to simply not come out of the tunnel, to forfeit the game entirely and let the NBA figure it out. Doc Rivers stood in the middle of all of it. Rivers himself is a black man raised in Chicago, the son of a police officer, a man who had grown up understanding the particular texture of American racism, the daily administrative version of it, the way systems excluded people while maintaining the language of fairness. He was now a head coach in the NBA, which is a position that requires you to hold every individual player's emotional state in your hands at the same time. He had to decide whether to tell those men to play basketball. He had to decide what it would cost them if they didn't, and what it would cost them if they did. He has spoken about those hours, the weight of them, the impossibility of a correct answer. He knew there wasn't one. He made a decision he could live with. The Clippers would play, but they would make their statement visible. During warm-ups, they removed their Clippers shooting shirts and turned them inside out, hiding the team's branding, leaving them in a pile at centre court before the game began. It was a powerful image, the symbolic rejection of a franchise identity while being forced by circumstance to still represent that franchise. Photographs of that pile of jerseys went around the world within minutes. The Warriors, in their locker room, made a similar but quieter choice. They removed their warm-up jerseys before tip-off and played the pre-game in plain shooting shirts. No team name, no branding, just players standing on a court reduced to themselves. And then they played. Staples Center held 19,000 people on a playoff Saturday afternoon, and every seat was filled. Outside the building, protesters gathered on the sidewalk with signs and voices. Some fans inside held signs of their own. Others wore tape over their mouths, a symbol of everything that hadn't been said for 33 years, while Donald Sterling ran a basketball team. The building hummed with a frequency that had nothing to do with basketball and everything to do with the question hanging over all of it. Was this enough? The question, I want to be clear, was not about the symbolic gestures. Those were real, and they mattered. The question was whether playing the game at all was the right thing to do, whether sport should pause for something larger, whether the moment required something more extreme than a pile of shirts at centre court. Understand what these players had at stake. This was the first round of the playoffs. Every professional athlete in the country understands that post-season appearances are finite, precious, hard-won. These players had trained for months. Their families were in the stands, their contracts were structured around performance. The machinery of professional sport has enormous gravity, and refusing to step into that machinery, even for a day, even for a single game, requires a willingness to absorb consequences that most 26-year-olds haven't been prepared to absorb. Stephen Curry scored 24 points that afternoon. He played with the controlled precision that was becoming his signature, calm, efficient, the quiet devastation of a shooter who doesn't need crowd energy to find his rhythm. He hit three-pointers from distances that made the television broadcast announcers stumble. He played beautiful basketball, and the moment the final buzzer sounded and the Warriors walked into the locker room with a Game-1 victory, the noise from outside the protesters, the debates, the question of what should happen to Donald Sterling came rushing back in as if it had been held at bay for 2 hours by something as fragile as the sound of a buzzer. In the locker room afterward, reporters crowded in immediately. The questions weren't about the game. They were about the tape, about Sterling, about what the players thought should happen, about whether they had considered not playing. Stephen answered those questions carefully with the measured thoughtfulness that had become part of his public identity. He said it was disgusting. He said it had no place in the game. He said he hoped the league would act decisively. Every word was true. None of it was the thing pressing hardest against the inside of his chest. He knew it as he was saying it. 2 days after that game, NBA Commissioner Adam Silver stood at a podium in New York City and handed down one of the harshest punishments in the history of American professional sports: lifetime ban from the NBA, $5 million fine, and a public statement that Silver would pursue every legal avenue available to him to force the sale of the Clippers franchise. His voice was controlled and even his sentences precise, but there was something underneath the language that you could feel, even through a television screen, genuine anger and the decision to do something with it rather than manage it into a press release. The reaction was immediate and nearly universal. Players across the league praised Silver. Sponsors who had already begun disassociating themselves from the Clippers, CarMax, State Farm, Mercedes-Benz, Kia among them, responded to the commissioner's statement. Donald Sterling hired lawyers and fought the forced sale, called in favours, tried to reframe the tape as an illegal recording, tried to suggest his girlfriend had manipulated him, tried to make himself the victim of a private conversation being turned against him by an unfair world. None of it worked. His estranged wife, Shelley Sterling, negotiated the sale of the team to former Microsoft CEO Steve Ballmer for $2 billion. The transaction closed in August 2014. Donald Sterling's name was removed from the building, and by November, when the new season opened, everything looked on the surface resolved. The bad actor had been removed. The system had worked with unusual speed. The machinery of professional basketball resumed. Stephen Curry began what would become the most dominant stretch of shooting in the history of the sport. The 2014-15 Warriors were different from anything anyone had seen in that building before. Steve Kerr had been hired as head coach, replacing Mark Jackson. Kerr was a thoughtful man, a former player himself, a five-time champion as a member of the Chicago Bulls and San Antonio Spurs. He had grown up internationally. His father was the president of the American University of Beirut and was murdered there in 1984 by a car bomb when Steve was 18 years old. Kerr carried that history quietly but completely. He understood loss and resilience in ways that shaped how he led people. Under Kerr's system, the Warriors played a kind of basketball that felt genuinely new. Fast, fluid, shot from everywhere, with every player capable of making decisions. The philosophy trusted intelligence over size. It rewarded ball movement and unselfish play, and at the centre of it was Stephen Curry. Finally fully healthy, finally with an offensive system that let him use every tool he had built during those rehabilitation years. He won the Most Valuable Player award in 2015. The first unanimous MVP in NBA history in 2016. He broke the record for three-pointers made in a single season, then broke his own record. The Warriors won 73 games in the 2015-16 regular season, the most wins in NBA history to that point. Stephen Curry was shooting the ball from so far out that the defensive analytics community had to rebuild entire sections of their models to account for him. He was changing the geometry of the sport in real time. Championships came. 2015, 2017, 2018. The Warriors became what dynasties become in the social media age, both universally admired and widely resented, the target of every other team's summer planning, the team against whom every other team measured itself. Kevin Durant arrived for the 2016-17 season and made them nearly unbeatable, which made them, for some fans, nearly impossible to root for. Sports require opposition. The Warriors had, for a period, too little of it. Through all of it, the parades, the records, the television appearances, the Splash Brothers nickname, the Riley Curry press conference moments that made the entire internet fall briefly in love through all of it, Stephen Curry kept returning to that Saturday in April 2014. Not obsessively, not in a way that disrupted his performance or his focus. But it was there, present, the memory of a locker room decision he couldn't entirely live with. He began to talk about it publicly, carefully, over a period of years. First, in passing, acknowledging that the players' response to the Sterling situation could have been stronger. Then, in more detail, then, in a 2021 interview that ran at length in a long-form publication, he addressed it with the kind of direct honesty that is genuinely uncommon in professional sports at the highest level. He said that, looking back, the players should have refused to play. He said that at the time they were afraid not of Sterling, not of the league, not of public consequence, but of themselves, of their own power, of what it would mean to say no to something as enormous as a playoff game and hold that refusal together as a group. He said they weren't prepared for that. The world that had trained them to be professional athletes had not trained them for the moment when being a professional athlete wasn't the most important thing in the room. But listening carefully to everything around that word, what he meant was something closer to unprepared, and the distinction matters. Naive implies foolishness. Unprepared implies a structural failure, something that wasn't the players' fault entirely. The league, the teams, the agents, the whole vast apparatus of professional sport, none of it had ever developed a language or a protocol for this. Nobody had ever run a drill for what to do when the owner of a franchise turns out to have believed his players were beneath him all along. There was just a locker room and a clock, and a decision that had to be made before the decision made itself. In 2020, the world changed in a different way. The murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis on May 25th of that year sent a shock through the country that reached every industry, every institution, every conversation. The NBA was in a bubble in Orlando, Florida, playing its season behind closed doors and without crowds. Every player living in a hotel and practicing in an empty arena. When Jacob Blake was shot 7 times in the back by police officers in Kenosha, Wisconsin, on August 23rd, the Milwaukee Bucks did not come out of their locker room for a scheduled playoff game against the Orlando Magic. They stayed in. Their statement was simple and direct, and refused to allow any ambiguity. We will not perform while our people are being killed. Within hours, every other first-round series had stopped. The WNBA went silent. Major League Baseball cancelled games. The NBA paused entirely for 3 days, while players met with team owners and the league's leadership to discuss what changes were possible, what commitments could be made, what the game owed the country in that moment. They eventually returned to the courts, having negotiated the conversion of arenas to voting centres, having secured commitments to social justice initiatives, having made their collective leverage felt in a way that had ripple effects beyond sports. Stephen Curry watched all of this from Atherton, California. He watched his peers, some of them his teammates, many of them the young players who had grown up watching him do something that he and his locker room had not done in 2014. And he felt a specific thing watching it. He has tried to describe it in various settings, and the description is always careful, always honest. It wasn't jealousy. It wasn't relief. It was something like recognition the sight of young men doing what he wishes he and his generation had known how to do, combined with the full awareness that the possibility of that moment in 2020 was built, at least partly, on everything that happened in 2014. The failures of one generation can teach the next generation something, if the people who failed are willing to be honest about it. He has been willing, that's the thing. He didn't have to revisit 2014. He has 4 championships. His career can sustain several significant omissions and still be remembered as extraordinary. He could have let history be the judge and trusted that history would be kind. Instead, he kept bringing the memory back up, kept examining it in front of people, kept refusing to let the trophies be louder than the thing that bothers him. There's a specific detail that has stayed with me since I first read his extended comments on 2014. He said that for years after that playoff series, whenever he would see photographs or footage from that Saturday, the Clippers' jerseys piled at centre court, the teams warming up in plain shirts, the crowd's particular energy in Staples Center, he would feel something he struggled to name precisely. Not shame, not embarrassment. He described it as something like an unfinished sentence, as if the morning of April 26, 2014, had posed a question, and the answer that came playing the game, making a symbolic gesture, trusting the commissioner to handle the institutional consequences, was the right answer to the wrong question. The right question was bigger. The right question was, what are we willing to sacrifice to make clear that this is unacceptable? That question didn't get answered that Saturday, and some part of him has been answering it ever since, in the way that matters more than any single game, through how he has chosen to use his name and his money and his platform and his time. After the championship in 2015, when he was at the full height of his celebrity, Stephen and Aisha Curry launched Eat, Learn, a foundation focused specifically on the city of Oakland. Not the Bay Area broadly, not some generalized American childhood, but Oakland, the city that had filled Oracle Arena when the Warriors were a losing team. The city that had held him through the ankle surgeries and the uncertainty and the years when being the 7th pick started to feel like a verdict. Eat, learn, play, targeted childhood hunger, education access, and youth athletics. It identified specific schools in specific underserved neighborhoods and committed to them over years, not just seasons. It was not a celebrity charity designed to generate good press. It was an organization built to operate in places where the press was unlikely to follow. In 2020, during the presidential election, Stephen Curry became one of the most active player voices in the country around voter registration and turnout, not in the broad inspirational sense, but specifically among young black men, a demographic that the Democratic Party had historically taken for granted and occasionally lost as a result. He did interviews, he made calls, he sat on panels. He talked about the specific mechanics of voting, how to register, how to find your polling place, what to do if you encounter obstacles. He talked about it with the specificity of someone who understood that inspiration without information is decorative. He wanted people to actually vote. He knew the audience he was talking to. He spoke their language. He has talked openly, in the context of all of this, about his daughters. He has 3 children, Riley, Ryan, and Cannon. He talks about Riley and Ryan, his oldest girls, in a way that reveals how profoundly fatherhood has recalibrated his understanding of what he owes the world. He wants them to grow up in a country that has moved forward. He wants the world they inherit to have been moved forward by people who had the resources to move it. He is one of those people. He has always been one of those people. It took 2014 to make him fully understand that. None of this undoes that Saturday. He doesn't want it to. That's the thing that is clearest in everything he has said about it. He has no interest in the redemption narrative that erases the failure. The failure is information. The discomfort he carries is a compass. He knows that a man who makes peace too quickly with his own silence is a man who will be silent again the next time the moment asks something of him. When Golden State won the championship in 2022, Curry's 4th, and in many ways his most personal, coming after Kevin Durant's departure, after 2 injury-plagued seasons, after the dynasty had seemed, to many observers, to be over, the moment on the court when the final buzzer sounded was one of the most raw things professional sports had produced in years. He fell to his knees at half-court, not in exhaustion, in something that looked like pure, uncontained relief. He had not only won, he had won without the piece that many people believe was the reason the Warriors won at all. He was the reason. He had always been the reason. And he finally got to say that with the scoreboard. In the locker room after, in the middle of the celebration, a young reporter made it through the crowd and asked him a question about legacy. What did he want people to remember? Curry was quiet for a long moment. Long enough that the reporter glanced at his recorder to make sure it was still running. Then he said, "I want people to know that I tried to be honest about when I got it wrong, that the rings weren't everything. That I kept asking myself whether I was doing enough, and that the answer to that question kept changing, which meant I kept having to change with it." He paused. Then, "I'm still working on the answer." That sentence will not be on the highlight reel. It will not appear over slow-motion footage of him shooting from the logo. It will not be the soundbite that plays at the Hall of Fame induction ceremony in 15 years. But it might be the most important thing he ever said, because it is the kind of sentence that takes something to say. It takes the willingness to stand next to your own legend and point at the place where the legend doesn't quite cover. Because here is what this story is really about. Underneath the basketball and the tape and the April weekend and the championships. It's about power, what it is, when you have it, and what it means to understand it late. Stephen Curry had enormous power on that Saturday in April 2014. Not just his talent, the collective power of two rosters of elite professional athletes, all of them with platforms and audiences and contracts and names that meant something. If those players had refused to play that day, if the teams had stood outside those arenas in their warm-ups and said, collectively, figure this out before we come back inside the league, would have moved faster than it did. The owners would have moved faster. The entire conversation about what professional sports owed the people who played it would have accelerated by years. That's not speculation. It's what happened in 2020, at smaller and larger scale, in multiple sports simultaneously. When players hold the line together, institutions move. That is not a radical observation, it is a mechanical one. The players in 2014 didn't know that with the certainty needed to act on it. Part of that was inexperience. Part of it was the absence of historical models. Nothing quite like that moment had happened in the modern NBA. Part of it was the pressure of the moment itself, the playoffs, the cameras, the gravity of the machinery they were being asked to stop. And part of it, Stephen Curry has acknowledged, was fear. Not of Sterling, of themselves, of whether they were big enough for the moment. They were. He knows that now. The frustration of knowing it now is precisely what keeps him talking about it. There is a photograph I keep thinking about from that Saturday. It was taken during pre-game warm-ups. Stephen Curry is standing near the three-point arc, ball in his hands, eyes somewhere that isn't the basket. His expression is hard to read. Not the focused look of a player running through his mental preparation, something else. Something that looks like a man standing inside a decision that hasn't fully settled, like a person who is about to do something and isn't entirely sure it's what the moment requires of him. Maybe the photographer didn't intend to capture anything like that. Maybe I'm reading backward from everything Curry has said since and seeing things in the frame that aren't there. But the photograph exists, and looking at it now, knowing what I know, there's something in it that feels true. There is a girl in Oakland right now, maybe 9 years old, maybe 10. She goes to a school that receives support from Eat, Learn, Play. She shoots around on a court that was built with foundation funds. She has no idea who Donald Sterling is. She has no idea what happened in April 2014, what was on a tape, what pile of jerseys meant, what in a building in Los Angeles. She just knows there's a court and a ball, and somebody cared enough to make sure she had access to both. She doesn't need to know the full story for the full story to be true. The greatest acts of repair happen quietly, over years, in places that aren't designed for cameras. They're built out of regret turned into action, out of the decision to let the failure mean something instead of letting the championships bury it. Stephen Curry will be in the Hall of Fame. His shooting records will almost certainly stand for decades. The dynasty he anchored will be a case study in how to build a sustained winner in the modern NBA. His name will be in the conversation whenever people argue about who the greatest players of his era were, and probably of all time. The legacy is settled, and it's going to be fine. But ask him, on a quiet Tuesday morning before the season starts, what he thinks about when the noise dies down and there's nothing between him and his own memory. Ask him what he carries. And he'll tell you about a Saturday in April 2014, a locker room in Oakland, a decision to play. He'll tell you about the weight of it. He'll tell you that the weight doesn't get lighter with championships, that the rings sit in one part of you and the regret sits in another, and they don't cancel each other out. They coexist. They ask different things of you. The regret asks you to be honest, to keep going, to refuse the comfort of thinking that the work is done just because you've accomplished things. Stephen Curry, four-time champion, the greatest shooter the sport has ever produced, is still doing that work. He was 26 years old and didn't know his own power. What separates him from most people isn't that he eventually learned it, it's that he never let himself forget the cost of learning it late. He never allowed the accomplishments to become his alibi. He kept showing up to the memory, kept refusing to let it settle into something harmless, kept insisting that it meant something, which means that every clinic, every foundation grant, every voting initiative, every honest sentence spoken to a reporter who didn't expect honesty is connected to that Saturday morning, to those 9 minutes and 24 seconds of audio, to the sound of a buzzer. Standing up when it costs something is always the hardest version of standing up. Stephen Curry stood up eventually. He's still standing. And the fact that he's been honest about the version of himself who didn't, that's the kind of courage that the 4 championship rings don't explain. If this story made you sit with something uncomfortable, a moment you had the chance to say something and didn't, a time when power sat in your hands and you set it down because the weight of the moment was too much, then carry it the way he carries his. Don't bury it. Let it mean something. Let it change what you do next time the moment arrives. Subscribe so you're here for the next one. Because these are the stories that live underneath the highlights, in the quiet parts of the record that the trophy cases don't show. And they're everywhere. Once you know how to look, Stephen Curry is still working on the answer. That might be the most important thing about him. But let me go back. Let me go back to something that gets overlooked in almost every telling of this story, and it's the thing that, to me, explains everything that came after. Donald Sterling did not appear out of nowhere in April 2014. He had been there the whole time. 33 years in the NBA. 33 years of owning a franchise in Los Angeles, one of the most visible basketball markets in the country, a city that is roughly half people of color, a city that has always had a complex and often brutal relationship between its black communities and its institutions of power. Sterling had been there through all of it, and he had not hidden who he was. He had simply been tolerated. In 2003, the United States Department of Justice sued Donald Sterling for housing discrimination. Sterling owned multiple residential apartment complexes in Los Angeles, and the lawsuit alleged that he systematically refused to rent to black and Latino applicants. His property managers, the DOJ alleged, were instructed to direct black applicants away from buildings and toward less desirable units. The evidence was detailed, the case was documented. History involving discrimination in the rental housing market. He did not admit wrongdoing. He paid the money, and the case was closed. The NBA knew about this. The players knew about it. League executives knew the history of the man who owned the Clippers. And for another 9 years, nothing happened. Sterling continued to sit courtside at Clippers games, continued to sign paychecks, continued to make decisions about the professional lives of players who were, in his private world, something other than full human beings. He was tolerated because he paid his bills, and his team won enough games, and disrupting the arrangement would have been complicated and uncomfortable and expensive. Institutions make that calculation constantly, and they almost always choose the comfortable side of it until the cost of comfort becomes impossible to absorb. The tape made the cost impossible to absorb, not because the information was new, but because it was undeniable. There is a specific kind of enabling that depends on plausible deniability, the ability for people involved to tell themselves that maybe they were wrong, maybe the rumors were exaggerated, maybe the lawsuits were frivolous. The tape eliminated all of that. His voice, his words, no room for interpretation. And so an institution that had tolerated this man for 33 years suddenly had to account for 33 years of tolerance, And the players on those two courts on that Saturday afternoon were standing inside that accounting whether they wanted to be or not. Stephen Curry has said that he didn't fully understand any of this at 26. He understood that the tape was outrageous. He understood that Donald Sterling was a racist. He understood, in the abstract, that this was a defining moment. What he didn't fully understand was the institutional history that made the moment what it was, that he and his teammates weren't responding to a single incident, but to the visible end of a very long story that the league had been hoping wouldn't need to be told. Understanding that history changes what refusing to play would have meant. It wouldn't just have been a statement about Sterling and one tape. It would have been a statement about 33 years. About a system that kept a man in the league who had no business being in the league. About the price of that tolerance, which had been paid quietly every day by every black player who laced up their shoes in a Clippers uniform while their owner thought of them in the terms he expressed on that recording. Refusing to play would have been saying, we know what this is. We know how long it's been happening. And we are not going to perform while you figure out how to respond. That is a different statement than the symbolic gestures made that Saturday. Not better by simple comparison. It's not as if the pile of jerseys at centre court meant nothing, but different in kind, different in scope, different in what it demanded from the institution in response. Curry has arrived at this understanding over years, and the arrival was not clean or sudden. It came through conversations with older players who had different contexts and different frameworks. It came through reading. He has talked about the books that have shaped how he thinks about race and power in America, and the reading is serious, not performative. It came through fatherhood, which has a way of making abstract moral questions specific in a hurry. And it came through watching what happened in 2020, which provided a kind of historical rhyme, a moment close enough to 2014 to be recognizable, different enough to show what a different choice looked like. What he saw in 2020 was this. When the Bucks stayed in their locker room, the thing that had always seemed too costly, disrupting the machinery of professional sport at the playoff level, turned out to be survivable. The world did not end. The league came back. The players returned to the courts. The season was completed, and in between, something real had shifted. Not everything, not as much as anyone hoped, but something. The conversation about what athletes owe the world when the world is asking something of them, that conversation moved. It moved because athletes exercised their collective power and the institution responded. In 2014, they didn't know that was possible, or rather they didn't know it with the certainty needed to bet on it. That's the thing about being the first person to do something. You don't have the evidence of its being done. You have to act on the belief that it will work without proof. The Bucks in 2020 had, in some ways, the gift of 2014's incomplete gesture. They could see what a partial response had produced. They could see what the ceiling looked like when you stopped short of the thing the moment was asking for. Stephen Curry gave them that, in a way. Not intentionally, not as a model, but the history of 2014, including its disappointments, became part of the context in which 2020 happened. Every movement carries the unfinished work of the movement that came before it. Every generation of athletes inherits the choices made by the generation before them and either learns from those choices or repeats them. There is something specific that he has said about what he would tell his younger self, if such a conversation were possible. Not a speech, not an inspirational monologue, something more practical. He has said he would tell the 26-year-old sitting in that locker room, "The league will survive this. The playoffs will go on. Your career will be fine. You are more protected right now, in this moment, by the weight of collective action than you will ever be by compliance. The worst thing that can happen if you stay in this locker room is that a game is postponed. The worst thing that can happen if you go out there and play is that you spend the rest of your life explaining why you did." He knows which of those outcomes he's been living with. I want to be clear about something else, because this story can tip into a kind of retrospective severity that doesn't honour the actual complexity of what those players faced. No one in that locker room was wrong to be uncertain. No one was wrong to be afraid of the unknown. The players who chose to play and who chose to make their symbolic protest were not cowards. They were young men operating in real time inside a system that had enormous gravity and no script for this particular scenario. The criticism Stephen Curry levels at himself is not the kind that should be extended outward to every player who made the same choice. He is accountable for his own decision. He is not prosecuting anyone else, but he is also not letting himself off the hook. And that specificity, the willingness to accept the discomfort of your own accounting without either dramatizing it into something larger than it was or minimizing it into something smaller, that is actually a form of moral clarity that you don't see often. Most public figures, when they look back at a complicated moment, do one of two things. They explain it away, find the extenuating circumstances and build a wall of context around the decision until it's no longer possible to call it a mistake. Or they perform guilt about it, make the regret louder than the action it refers to, wear it as a kind of credential. Stephen Curry has done neither. He has simply told the truth about what happened, in a measured and precise way, and let the truth be what it is. That takes something. After 4 championships, after unanimous MVP awards, after your name becomes a shorthand for a certain kind of athletic excellence, taking a hard look at a single Saturday and saying that was not enough. I knew it then, and I know it now, and I have tried to let that knowledge make me better. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, the thing. The last time Stephen Curry spoke publicly about this in any depth was in the run-up to the 2023-24 season. He was doing a media availability in the Warriors' practice facility in San Francisco. The team had moved from Oakland to the Chase Center in San Francisco a few years prior, a transition that had its own complicated meaning for the East Bay community that had held the franchise through its losing years. A reporter, catching him at the end of a long session, asked a loose question about regrets, not specifically about 2014, just generally if there was anything in his career he wished he'd handled differently. He took his time. He said there were several things, as anyone honest about a long career would say, and then he mentioned April 2014. He mentioned it in the context of a broader thought, that the things he carries aren't always failures of basketball, aren't always wrong reads or missed shots or series he wishes had gone differently. That the thing he carries most, the one that surfaces most reliably when he is quiet with his own memory, is the morning he chose the familiar thing when the moment was asking for something unfamiliar. He said it simply, without drama, without the vocabulary of a prepared statement. He said it the way a person says something true in the middle of a conversation when they've been saying it to themselves for long enough that it comes out clean. The reporter wrote it down, and maybe 20 people read the transcription of that media availability, maybe fewer, but he said it, because that's who he is now. Because the man who came out of those 3 ankle surgeries and those rehabilitation rooms and those years of learning the mechanics of his own shooting motion is also the man who came out of April 2014 changed. Smaller in one sense, stripped of the certainty that doing the right thing is always obvious. Larger in another, more determined to earn the platform that greatness gives you, rather than just receiving it. He is not finished. The career may eventually end. The playing days are finite, as all playing days are. But the work he is describing, the work of being honest about when you fell short, of using what you have to do better than you did before, of letting a regret be a compass instead of a weight, that work doesn't have a final buzzer. It just keeps going. Stephen Curry keeps going. That is, in the end, the whole of it. If this one stayed with you, if something in this story made you sit longer than you expected with a memory you've been carrying, share it with someone who needs to hear that the most powerful thing a person can do is stay honest about their own story. Hit the like button. Subscribe, because the next one is coming, and the people in these stories are still out there, still working on the answer. The answer is always still being written. That's not a weakness. That might be the whole point.